Good evening. What a joy to be here with you tonight. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking this time to think together about bringing healing in our communities and in our world. The title of the talk is Spiritual Discovery, How You Can Better the World. That's a really big subject. So I just want to say up front that we're going to tackle this subject with all humility. I hope this will feel less like a big formal presentation and more like sitting around the kitchen table together with friends, maybe with a cup of tea, just talking about big ideas. The things that concern us, the things that are important to us, the things that inspire us, successes we've had, and the things we're still working on, and maybe ideas about how we can move forward. We're going to break this up into a few parts. We're going to talk first about this phrase, spiritual discovery, and what that even means. We're going to talk about its relationship with healing. Talk a little bit about context of this movement, the founder of this movement. We'll talk a little bit more about how healing happens. And then we'll kind of take all that and start talking about how that makes a difference in the world for the better. As Mark mentioned briefly, after a little bit, about at the hour, Mark's going to come back up, and we're going to have a little bit more of a discussion together. I'm going to ask him some questions to share from his perspective as editor of the Monitor, and then we'll have time for questions and answers too. So hopefully that sounds all good. I'm going to start out by telling you a story. It's kind of a two-part story. It starts with me in high school, and I saw a counselor. Now, this wasn't something I sought out to do, but it was just kind of part of the curriculum, and it ended up happening. And in the course of the conversation with this counselor, she started asking me questions about my background, and I started sharing from the heart some of the things that had been tough for me when I was younger. At the end of all this, she gave me a bit of a prognosis. She said that I was going to have confidence issues and trouble in relationships, and a number of other things along those lines. Now, I'd been relatively happy, going along okay in high school, but this brought up a lot of things that had been hard for me, and it gave me a kind of a sense of a lack of hope. It made me feel like the stuff that had weighed on me in the past was going to weigh on me in the future and even define me and define my future. I went into kind of a spiral of, well, depression might be a strong word, but it was an intense kind of mental darkness. A few months later, though, I found myself sitting on the couch, and this little thought came to me, and this is not the deepest thought in the world, but it got me thinking again. And the thought was, you know, you were still hopeful and even joyful, even when some of the toughest stuff was going on. Why is it that now, when it's over, and you're forward in your life, you're going to have less hope? You're going to be weighed down by that and not be able to be happy? And like I said, not the deepest thought in the world, but what it did make me do is start asking questions. Now, what is it then that defines me? I'd been told that it was my past history. I'd been told that it was kind of a normal cause and effect situation. And yet, suddenly I started thinking, well, if I could be happy then, why can't I be happy now? Now, wait a second, where does happiness come from? Wait a second, who am I in the first place? What defines me? What defines my future going forward? I didn't have a lot of answers for that right away, but I did start to get the sense that I was more. I was more than just this prognosis. I was more than just the stuff that had been tough for me. It was enough to break out of that cycle of darkness. And actually, as an analogy, I would say it was like if you see the sunrise and you imagine somebody who just doesn't want that sun to rise and who's standing there and who's just shouting at it. You cannot rise. I don't like you. You're no good. Where have you been all this time anyway? It's been darkness. Doesn't really matter what you say, right? The sun's going to rise. You can jump up and down, you can hoop, you can holler. It's going to do what it's going to do. And that's just a little bit, in not so many words, of the feeling I started to get. My life was on a trajectory. It was going to be what it was going to be, but what it was going to be was not defined by anyone else or anything else. It was defined by something so much deeper. And I went on a bit more of a quest to figure that out. Now, at the same time, I got actually a kind of positive attitude, and I started thinking, well, look, if I want to be somebody, if I want to have good in life, I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to do everything it takes to fulfill this model of success. The problem with that was my model of success was based more on the get into a good school, get a type of job with a particular name and a particular salary and a particular kind of influence in the world. Didn't quite know what that meant yet, but I knew that those jobs were out there and I was going to get one. But first I needed to get into a school, and because my family had some serious money issues, I needed to get a scholarship to get into that school, which meant I needed to try really hard to stand out in order to be somebody. So at first, it was a somewhat authentic journey, but as things went on, it got less and less authentic. I graduated from high school, I did fine, I got into college, and more than ever, the activities that I signed up for, the classes, and so many of the things that I was doing had more to do with what they were going to look like to other people, how that was going to come across, and how that was going to help me fulfill this model of success. To go back to our sun analogy, it's maybe a little bit like attributing that movement of the sun to something other than what actually is the cause of the appearance of the sun moving. That is, in history, we know, for example, that folks thought at one period that there was a god on a chariot that dragged the sun behind the chariot. So they observed something, and not really knowing the true cause of that, not being able to explain it scientifically, they came up with a theory about it. And it was not an actual cause, but they really believed it at the time. And I'd say that's a little bit where I was at that point. I had this feeling that the sun was going to rise one way or another, but then I started to attribute it to something other than a really scientific sense of what actually defines us, what actually makes our lives move forward and progress. It was a little bit like the chariot dragging the sun was the thoughts that a good school, a good career, a good amount of money would drag my life across the sky to, its glory. Well, I started to get sick. It was the end of my first semester in college, going about this way, and I ended up in the kind of on-campus care facility. I was tested for tuberculosis because the symptoms that I was exhibiting were very similar. The test came back negative, but I was never diagnosed. Nobody figured out what I had. And I wasn't really looking for a diagnosis anyway. I was trying to pray about it. I was there about 2 weeks, and I had asked this woman to pray with me. Nothing really seemed to be inspiring me or moving anything forward until one day this woman said to me, "You know what? If you get better, you don't have to go back." It was like the light came on, a little bit like that moment sitting on the couch. Not maybe the deepest thought in and of itself, but it opened a door to me, and it started making me question again. It started making me think, why am I here? What is it that defines me? Why have I been going about things the way that I've been going? What I realized when she said, "You don't have to go back," was I really wanted out. I didn't want to be doing things the way that I was doing. It didn't feel good. And actually, within a day or so, my health started to recover. I made a commitment in my thought. I didn't really know what was going to be next, but I knew I wasn't going to keep going about it this way. I called my mom. I said, "Can I leave school?" It was like the last thing I would have thought in my model of success. She said, "Yeah, come home if you need to." So I did. Well, within a few days, my health was completely recovered. But while I was home, I started really diving in and thinking more about what defines us. And actually, what we're going to be talking about today relates to some of what I feel I discovered. I'll tell you kind of the end of the story, though, before we explore that, and that's that school wasn't the problem. I went back, but I changed almost everything, my course of study and a lot of other things. And it's not that it's been all roses since then, but I did feel that was a major turning point in my life, and the health things that had come up never came back again. So let's talk a little bit about actually the word prayer for just a moment. Because I told you that I was praying, that this woman was praying for me, and I think that's pretty integral to this equation. What is prayer? When we talk today about words like prayer, when we talk about words like spirituality, healing, God, they're just big words. They mean a lot of things to different people. and that's okay. When Jesus was asked, how do you pray? In the Bible, it's recorded that he said, first, go into your closet. Now, I'm sure there's lots of ways to look at that, but one way I like to think of it is kind of like, take a step back for a moment. Take a step back from the opinions around you, your own opinions. Take a step back from your knee-jerk reaction to things. Take a step back from fear. Take a step back from your preconceived notions. Take a step back from the surface appearance of things. Take a step back, and then what Jesus gave next is what many Christians call the Lord's Prayer. We're not going to dissect all that, but in essence, the Lord's Prayer talks about the nature of God, about our relationship with God, and about what that means for our lives. So, kind of broad picture, Jesus is asked, how do you pray? And he says, take a step back, and he says, get focused on the nature of God, your relationship with God, and what that means. So let's talk about God for a second. The Bible says that God is spirit. Actually, Jesus said that. God is spirit. So when we use the word spiritual today, when we talk about a spiritual perspective or spiritual discovery, that's where it's coming from. If God is spirit, then that which is spiritual is that which comes from God, a perspective from God, a discovery rooted in the nature of God. The Bible says a number of other things about God. It says God is love. It says that God is life, that God is truth, that everything that was made by God, and nothing was made that God didn't make. That God was the cause, the creator of everything. That God is of purer eyes than to behold evil. So this source, this cause, this force is all good, pure good. Now, of course, the Bible says some other things about God. There are many perspectives about God in the Bible. And since we're drawing on the Bible so much today as our guidebook to all of this, I just want to talk real quick about the Bible. Many of you here know the Bible, love the Bible. There may be some people here that don't know the Bible at all. And some of you may even think of the Bible as that book that you've been beat over the head with, judged or condemned by. So for that purpose, I'd like to just kind of get on the same page for a second. The Bible, as you may know, is not just one book. It's many books. It's poetry, it's letters, it's songs. It's written by people from many different walks of life, men, women, rich, poor, even people with different ideas about God. And it was written over a long period of time. But there are some themes that go through it. And one of those themes, I would say, is this theme of spiritual discovery. What that means is that you see these people in these tough situations. Sometimes it's a famine. Sometimes it's the middle of war. Sometimes they've been stripped of their community. Sometimes they've been outcast. Sometimes they've been labeled as incurable. But in these moments, again and again and again, these people from many different walks of life, what they find is that in these tough moments, something about their highest idea of God inspires them. It gives them a new view. And there's an effect that comes from that. This inspiration, this new way of looking at things, it actually has a tangible effect. In the middle of war, they find safety. And in the middle of being outcast from society, they find community again. Having been labeled incurable, they even find health and wholeness again. You see this again and again and again. There's a lot of paths to it, but there's kind of this theme that happens. And I think even though there's parts of the Bible that talk about God more like a tribal leader in the sky, some kind of being that favors some people and not other people, that even condemns or harms some or causes bad things to happen sometimes. I think what we have is this progression of the idea of God throughout the Bible, culminating in what Jesus talks about God as spirit, or later John talking about God as love. And some of the things that get attributed to the nature of God are a little bit like kind of the chariot dragging the sun across the sky. People experienced and have experienced and still do tough stuff. And the question is whether or not we're attributing that to God, or our sense of God is evolving to one of being a source of pure good, of life itself, truth itself, love itself, the cause of all that is good, of everything that was made. And so in the Bible, I think you find people wrestling with this, but you do find that when people get some sense of the power of good, of truth, of life and love, and right where they were, there's this tangible effect that happens. The Bible says something about us. Now we're talking about prayer again, and its relationship here with spiritual discovery and healing. And if you remember the pattern, Jesus talked about prayer being taking a step back, looking at the nature of God, about our relationship with God, and about what that means. So what does the Bible say about our relationship with God? Well, one of the things it says is right up front, like page 2, so I think it's pretty important. It says we're made in the very likeness of God. It says something similar a number of times throughout the Bible, and here's a passage that I love. This is from the book of Isaiah. It says, "Bring my sons from far away and my daughters from the ends of the earth, everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made." Now, sons from far away, daughters from the end of the earth, that's everybody, right? Formed and made by God. If we're talking about a God that is love itself, truth and life itself, that's pretty cool. But who heard the reason why? To glorify, for God's glory. Now, to glorify something, you could think of that as like going up with a street sign and saying, hey, I want to talk about this. I want to tell you all about it. That's one way to glorify something. If you look at a definition of glorify, one way of looking at it is to make something known. You could do that through a street sign, but if you think about it in terms more of our being, even more than just what we do, being made for the glory of God, if we're made in the very likeness of God, it starts to make sense that if God is truth and life and love itself, pure good, and we're made in the likeness of God, that we make God known through our very being, our very existence. That is, we are the place where God shines through. We are the manifestation of life itself and of love itself. Now think about this. When Jesus talked about God as spirit, he pointed out the word spirit relates to the word wind in the original language. And you can't see the wind, but you can see the effect of the wind. You can see the leaves moving in the trees when the wind is there. And in a similar sense, if we are the effect of God, if we are the glory of God, the place where all of this good is made manifest and shines through, it's like you can't see God, you can't see love, but you can see the effect of love. You can see the effect of truth. You can see the effect of life, right? You can see good when it's made manifest, whether that's in a hug or in honesty or in any other good quality or characteristic. And this seems to be what the Bible is saying we're made for. Now, how many of us wake up in the morning and go, made for the glory of God? Well done. This is not always what we think of first. How many, when you're going throughout your day and you're busy and you're watching the alerts pop up on your smartphone, go, made for the glory of God? Yep, right there. There's some more glory of God over there. Now, it doesn't always look like that, does it? This is not always what we're thinking. It's not always what we seem to see. It's certainly not what it seems like we're dealing with the majority of the time. But this is what the Bible seems to come back to as a theme, that this is inherent in who we are, that this is our spiritual DNA. We're built this way. It's not something we earn or work our way up to. It's not something we get from anybody else. It's not something that can be given or taken. It's just it's the very fabric of who we are. Now, not in a cookie cutter kind of a way, but in a completely individual and unique way, because we're talking about a God that is infinite. Most faith traditions would say God is infinite, God is omnipotent, God is omniscient. When we talk about a source like that, we're talking about a whole infinite variety of ways this can take shape, but always with the same kind of qualities and characteristics. Now, it doesn't look like that, as we said, but here's where the word discovery comes in. And I think this is so useful because when we talk about spirituality, a lot of times spirituality gets put in the camp of just positive thinking. Or in the worst case, it's said to be something more like the opiate of the masses, right? A positive thought which just dumbs you down so that you don't really think, maybe while you get steamrolled. One way or another, this idea that spirituality is just positive thinking, I mean, I don't think it matches up with what we see in the Bible of this kind of cause and effect relationship between an inspiration, a sense of God that then plays out in life in tangible ways. And the word discovery, to me, it really helps put this in perspective. When you think about discovery, discovery is what has progressed humanity throughout human history, right? Discovery. Discovery means that something's already there. It already exists. Nobody made it up, right? When the Wright brothers in the United States were learning more about the laws of aerodynamics, and Santos Dumont from Brazil, who was living in France, was doing the same thing around the same time, there was a few people around the world that were working at this idea of the laws of aerodynamics, but not one of them went up onto a tall hill and just jumped off and thought positively about flying. Right? It wasn't just a positive thought. It was a law that was actually there. It existed. It existed to be understood. It had always been there. Nobody earned it or worked their way up to it and suddenly deserved it more. And nothing humanity had ever been through could change what had always been there and always been true. These folks just started to understand it better. That's what a discovery is. It's something that's already there. But it is a mental journey. You know, we don't first see something and then discover it, right? We didn't first see planes flying through the sky and then discover the laws of aerodynamics. Discoveries very often happen on a mental level first. It's a reckoning, a coming to grips with what is actual and what is true. And the more that is understood, the more you can build something with it. The more you can do something with it, and it can take tangible form. It can have an effect. Now, this happens on every level. Think about human rights. Think about women's rights. Were women unequal? And then one day we kind of decided they should be equal? Or were they always equal? And people started to figure that out. We started to fight for that. We started to understand that. We started to build on that premise. We still got a ways to go. But isn't it a coming to grips with what has always been true? Whether you're talking about the color of skin or gender or any other thing, you're talking about civil rights, human rights, any other discovery, any other thing that has progressed humanity on any level, if you really think about it, it comes down to discovery every time. It's a better understanding of something that has always been possible, always been true, always been rooted in really quite a natural way things are and ought to be understood. And then we see the effect of that. Then we can build on that. To me, spirituality, genuine spirituality, is about discovery. It's not just about positive thinking. It's about learning more about what our source is, about what has always been true, about who we are, even in the face of how things appear to be. Think about that too. Discoveries have almost always flown in the face of how things appear to be. If you just looked at the flight thing, there was no evidence that that was possible or true. So when we start thinking about, okay, this sounds pretty far off, I do not feel like I am made for the glory of God. The world does not seem to be originating in, flowing out from a source that is pure good. No big surprise, right? Every discovery has flown in the face of the way things appeared to be. Every one. And that's not so strange. Now, here's another analogy for you. If I drew 7 plus 3 on a board, and I wrote equals, 7 plus 3, and I put it together, and I asked you guys, what is 7 plus 3? You would all know it's 73, right? No? Why not? I mean, there's a certain surface level logic to that, right? You take a 7 and a 3, and you put them together. What have you got? 73. That's only if you don't actually know how math works. But there's a certain surface level logic to it. Now, we look around the world, we look at our lives, we say, I went through this experience, therefore I am this. There's a certain surface level logic to that. But does it represent the actuality of things? any more than 7 plus 3 equaling 73 does. You say, if I get this kind of a job, if I make this kind of money, then I'll have safety, value, opportunity, whatever it is, certain surface level logic to it, but it doesn't represent the actual source of good. It doesn't actually represent where any of the things that our hearts yearn for come from. And this is the same, I think, across the board. If all good comes from this singular source, it's not a denominational source, it's not a religion, it's just, and it almost doesn't even matter what you call it. It's just the source of, it is life itself, truth itself, love itself, the principle of the universe. Now, the more I started to understand about this, the more I started to be able to build in a better direction. Implicitly, I started to feel this, and it empowered me. Knowledge is power. You've heard that before. And this is not compartmentalized. I told you how it bettered my emotional state. It bettered my physical state. It bettered even my kind of educational and career trajectory. Bettered my family relationships. When you talk about a law or a rule, it is not compartmentalized. 7 plus 3 equals 10 is not true for some people and not others, or for chairs but not tables. It's just kind of a fact that applies to all things equally. We tend to compartmentalize our lives, not on purpose. We're just kind of told that's how it is. We're told, okay, I get it. I get how some spirituality could uplift me, maybe. I can see how that might give me a better attitude, help my relationships. I could even maybe see how it makes me calmer, which takes away my stress. Maybe that helps my blood pressure, and maybe that has some health side effects. But what the Bible implies and shows in action again and again is that there is no compartmentalization here. Every aspect of all that is governed by the same rules. And the spiritual discovery that we're talking about, more about the nature of God, more about what that means about us and our relationship, despite the surface appearance of things, there is no aspect of life where that cannot and does not have a tangible benefit. Any aspect of our health or our lives. There was a woman named Septima Poinsett Clark. Anyone here heard of her? Any hands in the room? Wow. I don't blame you. I just heard about her a couple months ago. Martin Luther King talked about her as the mother of the civil rights movement. When he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize and flew to Sweden, he invited her to come with him. Now, we haven't heard about this woman, but he credited her in many ways with getting the ball rolling, and others did too. Some people called her the grandmother of the American civil rights movement and said there wouldn't have been a movement without this woman. So we've never heard of her, and yet what she did had a pretty tremendous impact. What she did, she was an educator. She was a teacher. And she started places of education, teaching literacy, teaching about citizenship. That is, teaching Americans what their rights were as citizens of this country. Teaching them even how to fill out basic forms. She's credited with saying that knowledge could empower marginalized groups in ways that formal legal equality couldn't. Knowledge. Well, knowledge of what? In this case, she was helping people see maybe a little bit more about who they were, more about what their rights already were, even if they were a little bit in the dark about that, more about how to stand up for themselves, and how to claim what was naturally theirs. I'm not going to labor on this point, but I love pointing to these things, and throughout the evening tonight, we're going to just look at examples like this tremendous woman who we don't really even know that much about, but who stood for something that was rooted in a much bigger sense of what is real and true. So when we get that little temptation to think, okay, this is just the spirituality stuff is just my positive thinking or my little self-help system or my religion or something, when you broaden it out and you take that step back, you see that people who have rooted their lives, whether it was in Bible days or in any period of time since then, right up until today, people who stand with a greater knowledge, a greater sense of the principle of how things work, of what is actual and true, and see inherent power in that, make change for the better. So you can't compartmentalize. Oh, I guess I want to tell you one other thing about her, and this is a little side note maybe, but there was one area where Septima Clark and Dr. King did not get along, and it was about women. She said, essentially, you see the equality of people in terms of race, but you don't fully see it in terms of gender, too. So in some ways, she was even in advance in terms of her clear sense of what was true. Really, this is, again, about discovery. Spirituality, from my point of view, spiritual discovery is what breaks us out of the box. We tend to have this sense of who we are, where we are, how things work, what's possible, and with the greatest dedication and the greatest heart, we will work within that box. We accept those limitations, and we work right here the whole time. And what I think spirituality does, and what you see the Bible showing that it does, is blowing that box apart, starting from a whole other foundation, building out from that foundation, and showing what's possible when we do. So just a little bit of context here. Let's take the next step. The word Christ. You know, the word Christ was not just the last name of Jesus, right? If he'd had a driver's license, it wouldn't have said Jesus Christ. First name, last name. Christ is a title. It was the Greek word synonymous with the Hebrew word Messiah. It meant anointed one. Another word that was associated with Jesus is Emmanuel, which means God with us. These titles, they symbolize the presence and the power of God that shone through the life of Jesus in such a unique way. And Jesus showed us something about grace. And that could be a whole talk in and of itself. I love that word. But maybe in just a sentence or so, I think we could define grace as the unearned love of God. It's that truth that pure goodness that is freely given, that again, we don't earn or work our way up to. When we look in the mirror and think, I don't deserve this yet, I'm not worthy yet, I don't get it enough, it's that dawning, that moment that just says, you don't make you. The world does not make you. I make you. Love itself defines you. It's the good of the universe freely given, unearned. Jesus showed us something about salvation, and that's a huge topic. But maybe in regard to what we're talking about, we could say that salvation is the discovery that nothing can separate us from the love of God, as St. Paul put it in the Bible. Jesus showed us something unique about a lot of things. He also showed us something unique about how to make change for the better. Jesus, this Messiah, was said to be a lion, and people were expecting that. A lion, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. This lion and its lion-like qualities or characteristics, many people thought was going to be a military leader, a political leader, somebody to come in and smash through the enemy and make things right again. And in Bible language, they were looking for a lion, but they got a lamb. And the lamb-like qualities were part of what is unique about the way Jesus made change in the world. It was through qualities and characteristics like humility, love, self-sacrifice, that were part of his ability to be a transparency for that presence and that power, that activity of God that was made manifest in his life. That same Christ, that same presence and power of God that is going on all the time. It didn't start when Jesus arrived on earth. It didn't leave when Jesus left. That presence and power of God, that activity of God, we see made manifest through the lives of those prophets that came before Jesus and the disciples that came after him and still here today. It's the presence and power, the activity of truth itself, of life and love itself, of what defines us, what creates, what causes, the principle of the universe. Jesus was this unique transparency for that in human history. but he showed us about how entire countries and empires could be changed from the inside out through the lamb-like qualities. That presence and power and activity of God, that Christ nature, is something that the founder of this movement, Mary Baker Eddy, felt she discovered in her own life also in a unique way. She went on to call what she discovered, she'd always been a devout Bible student, but she felt she discovered something unique at the midpoint of her life. She called it the science of Christ. To talk about discovering the science of something, Christian science is another way of putting it. This Christian science movement, well, Christian means it was rooted in the life, the example, the love, the healing of Christ Jesus. But to call it a science is to say that it's universal, it's equal, it's understandable, it's provable. When you think about a science, it's timeless, right? And a scientific fact like the laws of aerodynamics, as we said, don't apply to one group over another group. It's just for absolutely everybody. You also know that like in math class, you don't go to math class and get that math test and just say, I believe. You can't just write on the math test, I love math, I believe in math, I know there's an answer to all these equations, and then turn the test back in. Right? I know. You learn it. You learn the principles of math. You apply it to the equations. If you don't get the right answer at first, you go back and you learn a little bit more until you do. And this was what seemed to hit her, especially at a critical moment in her life. She found healing from chronic illness that had plagued her from when she was a little girl. She found healing from a severe accident. As these ideas clarified and crystallized with her, she began to help and heal people more and more consistently. She had always given her life to folks. She, when she could, was a substitute teacher, started her own little school for a little while. She later worked with homeopathic medicine to try and help other people and alleviate suffering, which she knew so much about because of the chronic illness that had plagued her from the time she was little. Her whole life was constantly about helping and healing people, but as she began to discover more of what she felt was this Christian science, this approach to Christianity, this lens through which to see the life, the example, the healing, the teachings of Jesus in this way that was more scientific, that is, a way that showed its timeless, universal nature, its understandable and provable nature, not just for some people, but for everybody. Her whole sense of how to help people and how to make change in the world for the better, I think, took a turn. Now, some people have called her a feminist. I mean, she was a woman at a time when women had very little rights, preaching, writing, on spirituality, no less. She started a church. She founded a publishing society. But I don't think she ever thought of herself as a feminist. I don't think the word feminist even existed then. But I don't think she thought of herself even as a reformer quite on that level. What seems really clear is that what she felt she was discovering, and any one of us could discover spiritually, about the nature of God, our relationship with God, about Christ, this power of the presence and activity of God in our lives, would bust the box apart. We didn't have to necessarily work within the box just to make transformation here. To build on something else inherently empowered us to move through anything that was contrary to what is normal and natural, would cause it to break apart, would cause it to fall away without even specifically attacking it. Her life modeled what is possible when you build on this level, and yet it was more the outcome of what she was discovering spiritually than it was the point or the power in and of itself. Does that make sense? I'm going to read you something from her book. This is her main work called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She wrote this. Quoting the first commandment in the Bible, she wrote, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." She said, "The first commandment is my favorite text. It demonstrates Christian science. She goes on to say, one infinite God, good, unifies men and nations, constitutes the brotherhood of man, ends wars, fulfills the scripture, love thy neighbor as thyself, annihilates pagan and Christian idolatry, whatever is wrong in social, civil, criminal, political, and religious codes, equalizes the sexes, annuls the curse on man, and leaves nothing that can sin, suffer, be punished, or destroyed. Quite a promise. But she believed it, and she built on that basis. Those who were benefited by what she was discovering, by reading what she was writing, went on and helped others too. The last 100 pages of this book are all stories of people who found radical healing in their lives, oftentimes from things that have been labeled as incurable, but not in any compartmentalized way. It was diseases, but it was addictions. It was cycles of oppression. It was bad habits. It was life being bussed out of that box and being grounded in something so much bigger. And the more that that was discovered, the more it was felt, the more it was experienced step by step, and the more it was proved. She helped and she healed people, just as she found healing in her own life. And then those people who experienced that went out and helped and healed others. And a movement was born. And that's why we're here today. We're sitting in a building built by this movement. She started the 2 magazines called the Christian Science Journal and Sentinel. I mentioned those because what I love about this is I think she recognized it doesn't look like this is what's going on. So we have a weekly magazine, a monthly magazine where people can write in, absolutely anybody, and talk about their own spiritual discoveries, the kind of breakthroughs they're having, the kind of healing they're experiencing in their lives. These publications have been printed without stop for well over 100 years so that we can see that contrary to the news alerts that pop up on a regular basis, this is going on. It is happening. Everyday people are experiencing this so that we don't feel so alone. Whatever our walk of life is, whatever our spiritual practice might be, we can see that this is happening. She started the Christian Science Monitor. We're going to circle back to that, as you know, towards the end, and I'm even going to tell you a quick story about Nelson Mandela and his relationship with the Monitor when I come back and do our final wrap-up. But I think she was really practical, that we cannot be ignorant to the issues of the world. You can't make spiritual discovery in a vacuum. You have to know what the issue seems to be, and then you have to dig beneath the surface of that in order to discover more, in order to upend it. Ignorance is not bliss. The opiate of the masses is not what practical, genuine spirituality is about. She wrote this in her book, too. Jesus of Nazareth was the most scientific man that ever trod the globe. He plunged beneath the material surface of things and found the spiritual cause. Now, how many of you have thought of Jesus as the most scientific man that ever trod the globe? That's maybe not the first phrase that comes to mind. But maybe within the context of what we're talking about, it starts to make sense if you think about science from this standpoint. In essence, one way that Mary Baker Eddy described her discovery was, she said, it was life in and of spirit. Life in and of spirit. Well, does that look what life is? What's the opposite of spirit? If you were to come up with an antonym for that word, spirit versus what? Matter, materialism. Okay, that's good. Matter and spirit. Now, if I told you one of these things is solid, substantial, tangible, powerful, beautiful, actual, and the other one is kind of ethereal, it's really just kind of a concept, which one would you say is which? I mean, don't we often, maybe even just by default, not consciously, kind of feel like spirit is that wispy, ethereal stuff that's maybe a concept, and matter is really the substance of life. But what this whole discovery was about was the substantial nature of spirit. Now, if spirit, let's just reason through this together for a second. If spirit is God, if spirit is the source of all beauty, of all that's balanced, of all that's useful, of all that's beautiful, of all that's wise, of all that's just, of all that's strong, of all that's good, then you can start to think of things pretty quickly that are strong and good and just and balanced and beautiful, right? And maybe then spirit doesn't sound quite so abstract anymore. It doesn't sound just like this thing that happens after we go to another plane of existence or something. We all know things that are strong, that are useful, that are practical, that are needed, that fortify us, that comfort us. Well, if this is all spirit, if this is spirit made manifest, then maybe spirit starts to seem a little less abstract. But then what is matter? Well, what if I told you matter is just a concept? Hang with me. What if I told you matter is just a word? It's a word to describe what we seem to experience, because we have to describe it, but it's really just a concept. It's a way of looking at spirit. Spirit is life. Spirit is all that is good and its manifestation, right? And then there's this lens through which we see all of that, and it's a distorted lens. It's kind of like the asterisk or the fine print on life. You know those commercials that promise you something good at the very end, have another voice come on, and maybe it's longer than the original part of the commercial, and it says, may cause death, destruction, bleeding, terrorism at any time. We see good, don't we? We see life. We see beauty. We see justice. We see these things. And yet, at the same time, is this kind of asterisk or fine print that says, was born and is going to die. Is vulnerable the entire time and could be destroyed unexpectedly along the way. We see men, and we see compassion and creativity. But then mixed in, we see anger, self-righteousness. We see women, and we see power and intelligence. And then mixed in to this distorted vision, we see weakness and something like an object. We see politicians, and we see selfless servants, dedicated. And then we see selfishness and conniving action. We see young people that are civic-minded, that are globally aware, but self-centered and can be violent. We see people like what we saw in the news this weekend, where hate seems to triumph over good, where death seems to overcome life, where what is strong and beautiful seems to become vulnerable. And we get this whole mixture, and this is what life seems to be. The Bible is not ignorant to this. Right after it says we're made in the likeness of God and all is good. In my point of view, it says, but let me tell you why it doesn't look that way. And it has this allegory. Story many of you may know, Adam, Eve. We won't talk about the whole thing. But these two characters, they're tempted. They're tempted after all is good to eat from this thing called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's the perspective that good and evil are mixed together. At first, it all seems good. Then when they digest the fruit of this knowledge of good and evil mixed together, the first thing they feel is shame. And then they feel kicked out of the garden of good. And then they feel like it's normal to strive and struggle and be in pain. Normal to participate in a zero-sum game, that is, just trying to get your little piece of the pie, and the more you get, the less somebody else gets, and vice versa. And this is the framework. Now, from my point of view, this is not a story of history. This is a story about what we deal with on a daily basis so that we're not so surprised. It's calling it out for what it is. First, it says there's all good. This is who we are. This is what defines us. It's grace. It's unearned. But then it says there's this distorted lens, this asterisk or fine print that says there's all this other stuff mixed in, and that's natural. When you look in the mirror, you see some good, but then you also think, and you're bombarded at times, like we all are, with thoughts of, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough. I'm funny, but I'm also disorganized. I like some people, and I hate some other people, or whatever it is. It's a bunch of information, but some of it is true, and some of it is a distorted sense. And to me, it's that vision of life, of the substance of existence, of the laws, of what's normal and natural, of what moves things, of what has the creation of things. It's that vision that it's all mixed together as good and evil that is matter. It is a material perspective. Matter is not a thing, it's a concept. It's a way of looking at spirit, solid, substantial, good of God, built into every one of us in the fabric of the universe. And so when we make discoveries, what we're doing is we're putting off that material perspective, and not in a compartmentalized way. The balance that we're talking about, it has to do with our health and our well-being. The justice and the freedom we're talking about, it has to do with our relationships and our workplaces, with our communities, with our governments. This is normal and natural. And again, there seems to be this cause and effect relationship. The more we discover of what is real and true, the more there is this tangible effect. I'm going to tell you, I want to read you one quick line here from Paul in the Bible. He writes, "Now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known." And from another translation, it's written this way: "Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely." So it's this incomplete vision of things that we're putting off and seeing more as God sees. So the story, it's of a grandfather who called me, and he wanted me to pray with him. And he said that he'd been estranged from his grandson for over a year. They used to have this really tight relationship. And then at a family gathering, breaking news had come out, a racially charged issue that really had a divisive effect on people, and people had some pretty different points of view about. Came up in the news. The grandson was impassioned by it. The grandfather had a totally different point of view, and the grandson couldn't take it. He couldn't even believe that the grandfather would have that point of view. And after that, wouldn't talk to him. Didn't matter what the grandfather said or did, it was no-go. So after a year of trying, he calls me and he says, "I want you to pray with me about this." So we agreed to pray. And one of the things that happened as we talked about things was, first we talked about, well, why do you think there was this reaction? What do you think was going on there? And the more we talked, the more he started to see what was behind this reaction. He actually, to his credit, very quickly got a whole new perspective of the issue. He started to see that what had been behind it was years, generations of frustration, of anger, of oppression, of injustice. And very quickly, he thought, I get it. I understand what that's about now. But what was interesting is it suddenly led to a feeling of heaviness. Well, what do I do about that? How do I even begin to make any kind of, impact on that or better that? How can my prayers have any impact on that? So we talked a little along the lines of what we're discussing tonight, that spiritual discovery is not about making something happen, right? Nobody created the laws of aerodynamics. When we pray, if we feel heavy, if we feel burdened, then we're kind of missing the point of what prayer is about. Prayer is about discovering what is already happening, what has already been done, even if it flies in the face of how things seem to be, with the knowledge that somebody standing for that, somebody building on that, whether that's just quietly as that truth dawns in our own perspective, or letting that move us to go out and take action and do something, like Mary Baker Eddy, who broke through these boundaries as the outcome of what she was discovering. One way or another, that discovery makes a tangible difference. We talked about how this is not about our little magic juju going out and kind of like making people think differently, convincing people of something, changing people. This is about witnessing to what is already true and good. This is about first feeling that grace, feeling its defining nature of us and of all reality, of all creation, of all humanity. Till it uplifts us to the point that we can see this. We're not just going to try and declare our way into it and just make affirmations that it's good. And this is not about willpower. It's quite the opposite. It's about that presence and activity of God, that Christ power, moving us, uplifting us. We get to be cared for in the process. We get to be uplifted and inspired in the process. This really changed his point of view. He actually told me in this email exchange that we had over a couple of weeks that he had a physical healing in the process. I didn't ask him about what it was. He was so excited about the bigger picture stuff, we almost kind of glossed over it, but I thought that was interesting. The last part of this was we talked about his grandson. He said, well, what do I do with this? And I said, now remember, this is not about you going out and convincing somebody of something. This isn't you trying to prove anything. How do you see your grandson? Do you see him as God sees him, or are you looking through this materialistic lens of him as being defined by his past history and these events, and not really being able to think for himself outside of that? That you have to swoop in there and kind of beat him into, getting that you're a good guy again. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And so he got that, and as he began to see more of what he was discovering was his grandson's true nature in the scheme of all of this, within a week, he was back at that household visiting his daughter and in another family gathering, and the grandson came out, and it was 180 degrees. The relationship rekindled. They became tight again. I don't think they had it was never any bumps ever again, but it was a really quick turnaround. This is not a compartmentalized thing. Jesus talked about it as the kingdom of heaven. He talked about it as salvation. So this is everything. It's everybody. It's all that we care about. It's all that we see. Not about a religion. It's about the nature of being. So when we talk about how to pray then for our communities or for the world, does anyone, I know some of you here pray. Some of you are activists in your own right. Do you ever wonder if it does any good? Do you ever pray and ask yourself, how do I know? How do I know if that prayer did any good whatsoever? Anyone? Does that ever wonder that? Good. That would be embarrassing if I was the only one. It's harder. When you pray about something in your own life and you feel like you're discovering something and this kind of perspective is dawning, and then you see a tangible effect, you get it. You see a cause and effect there. When you're working with somebody one-on-one and you see that, that's rewarding. But when you pray about something in the news, maybe it's going on the other side of the planet. Maybe it seems to get better, and you say to yourself, I don't know, did my prayer have any little part in that? Or maybe it seems to get worse. And you wonder, are my prayers doing any good? Well, how do we know? How could we possibly know with any kind of scientific certainty that our prayers make a difference for the world in our communities or on a global scale at all? Well, here's an analogy that helps me. You've got that I like math analogies, and I'm going to change it up and keep this really fresh. Here's a new one. Ready? 3 and 3 equals 6. Now, we know 3 and 3 equals 6, just as we know 3 trillion and 3 trillion equals 6 trillion, right? Anyone here doubt that 3 and 3 trillion equals 6 trillion? No? Okay, but who here could tell me what 6 trillion of anything looks like? 6 trillion grains of sand. Would it fill up this room? Would it fill up the city block? Hard to say. I have had a physicist in the audience once that said, well, 1 million grains of sand are this volume, and if you multiply that out, analogies break down at some point. But the point is, for the rest of us, 3 trillion and 3 trillion grains of sand, we know it equals 6 trillion. How do we know that with scientific certainty? Because we can prove that 3 and 3 equals 6. We can prove the principle, right? The scale is not so relevant. It's the exact same principle at work. So to the degree that we're proving it there, we know that it's true on any scale. So what happens when we go to pray about community issues, national issues, global issues? We tend to get sucked into just the surface appearance of things. But we can boil it down to the core mental elements in a way that helps us prove the principle. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. When I was in finance, I would watch a jobs report come out. It would say 200,000 new jobs created this quarter. And that day, the market would go down. Now, why? I had a positive number of new jobs. That sounds pretty good. But people were expecting 300,000 new jobs, which is why the market went down. So what was the primary factor at work that day? Was it the number of jobs? No, it was a mental element, wasn't it? You could call it disappointment or something like that. Fear, maybe. Well, fear, disappointment, those are mental elements we know something about. We all have to deal with that on a daily basis. If we were to go and pray about the economy, we could be praying about the amount of widgets built, imported, exported, dollars printed, what the Fed set the rate at, but we would have missed the mental element that was primary at work in the economy that day. Something that doesn't seem so far off, like 6 trillion, that we can't even understand. We know how to deal if we're making these discoveries on a daily basis, overcoming fear with truth, with love, overcoming imbalance with a sense of order through this movement of this divine love working in our lives. Now, let's look at a few other examples. The Berlin Wall, when that came down, who expected that to happen right about that time? Anybody see that one coming? For most people, it was pretty unexpected. Now, I knew somebody who was there and who said on the surface, you couldn't see anything changing, but you could feel it. Change was in the air. The one thing you could see was right before the wall came down, these prayer vigils were coming together by candlelight. Now, after the wall came down, there was a high-ranking Stasi agent who said, we were prepared for everything but candles and prayers. Mental elements. If you were to pray about that wall, you could be praying about all the actors involved. You could be praying about the countries involved. You could be praying about how many tons of concrete were in that wall. But there was thought behind it all. And as the thought started to shift, even in an imperceptible way, it led to a tangible result. South Africa, President de Klerk, you know who he was? Many of you. He was elected on the apartheid ticket. He believed in it. His party, his family believed in it. Somebody said to me it was like he went to bed one night believing apartheid was right and woke up one morning knowing it was wrong. And I don't actually think that's quite how it happened. I've talked to a few folks who lived there and who were reporters there, and they said it was not an overnight thing, but it was a new perspective, a new shift. And of course, he began meeting secretly with Mandela in prison and helped transition the country out of apartheid. So what happened there? Mental shifts, right? And we think of mental sometimes like spirit as being so abstract, and yet behind everything are the same kinds of qualities and characteristics that we're dealing with on a daily basis. When we face what seem to be even the smallest injustices, inequities, imbalances, fears, ignorances, when we are overcoming those things through love, through truth, through understanding, through spiritual discovery, then we're proving the principle in our lives. We're proving that this happens. And then when we go to pray about it on a bigger scale, we can get it beneath the people and personalities and histories and get it right down to those same mental elements, and we can know with some level of scientific certainty that the same principle applied on any scale makes a difference. And Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. Well, it starts to make sense if you think of it this way. This is not just sit up in your apartment and think happy, positive thoughts, but it is live it, prove it, demonstrate it, and then you know. Don't forget about the rest of the world. Make sure you're seeing the same principle applied through this lens for everybody, because it is universal. Now, this is where I'm going to pause, and I'm going to invite up Mark to come back, and we're just going to continue this discussion right where we're pausing. And I'm going to ask Mark some questions about how he has seen this playing out from his perspective as an editor of the Monitor. Thank you, Mark, again, for joining me. Mark was kind enough to say that he has enjoyed getting to know me in the process, and I just want to say the same. It's been really a delight. Mark has a great perspective, a historical knowledge of things that impresses me. I kind of feel like I experienced this stuff somewhat on a more micro level, and Mark can point to, a dozen different things in history that prove it, and I just go, wow, that's so cool. And I didn't want you to miss out on that perspective too. So I have just a few questions. This isn't overly rehearsed, but we did talk about what our 2 or 3 little quick questions might be. And the first thing I'd like to just ask is maybe you could share with folks a little bit about what you see the role of the Monitor to be, as well as what you see something like an exhibit like this, 1968 to today. How do you see that benefiting folks?
Well, I mean, I think one of the reasons I'm so excited to be here is because in so many ways your talk goes directly to the core of what the Monitor wants to do. Many people, if you know the Monitor, if you have subscribed to the Monitor, the phrase that's most often attached to it is to bless all men, to injure no man, but to bless all mankind. Mrs. Eddy said that's the object of the Monitor. That's what the Monitor does by doing what it's supposed to do. But what is it supposed to do? What is the actual intention of the Monitor? And it just fits beautifully with everything you said. I mean, she said that the intent of the Monitor is to spread undivided the science that operates unspent. And usually when I talk about this, I need to go and spend about 10 minutes explaining science, but he just did it for you. So really what the Monitor is about, it's about spreading what you just said. To me, it's when you have that understanding, when you have that beautiful revelation of these things that you were talking about, it's a gift. It's the grace that you're talking about. What do you do with that gift? Well, Mrs. Eddy said, you need to spread it. And so that's what the Monitor does, is it takes that viewpoint that says, I'm going to look at the world differently. I'm going to use a different set of criteria for deciding what the facts are, which is an interesting concept today in the news. But, looking deeper. To universal things. I mean, that's the thing, is that with so much of what we're seeing in the news right now, it's kind of one person comes from one perspective and one comes from the other, and you kind of, the talk breaks down because you can't go anywhere with that. But when you take it to a universal level, you're getting to something deeper. And I think the Monitor endeavors to really take that and to look through that lens. And I think in the context of this exhibition that's going on is just so apt in the sense that, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you think about 1968 and everything that happened then, it was just humanly a time of tremendous upheaval. But just look at what's come out of it. I mean, when you're thinking about the moonshot and what that did for our understanding of knowledge, and you think about that's when environmentalism began. All this thing that we're talking about, global warming and all this right now, that's when it started. That thought germinated. You think about the depth of the Cold War and standing for freedom, and most obviously, you think about equal rights, and you think about rights for minorities, rights for women, and what's happening now is a building on that. And I think when you think about 50 years ago, it's a very apt comparison, and I think it holds a lot of lessons that I think the Monitor helps explore.
So can you give us a couple examples? Maybe one of kind of a macro picture of where you see change, how you see things evolving based on these kind of perspective shifts, and maybe one on a little bit more micro level, on an individual level.
Really fast, right? This is going to be hard to do fast, but here we go. You ready? I'm going to get in the sprinter's blocks here. I mean, to me, what I see going on that's so interesting is if you're going to kind of look at, I'm specifically looking at America right now, but I think this is true about mostly throughout the West in the world. If you look at kind of what's driving the division and everything going on, I would say it comes down to 3 main elements. It comes down to race, it comes down to economics, and it comes down to religion. But if you then kind of step back and you look through that 1968 lens, or again, you said, what did Jesus say? He said, step back, look at these things differently. And what you see is the same things that we were going through in 1968 are the same things we're going through now. I did write something down because it's so relevant to me in terms of what Mrs. Eddy said to what we're going through right now. You can kind of tend to look at what we did in 1968 on race and kind of say, my goodness, that was hard. And just to get where we are, and it's coming up again. Why is this coming up again? Why does this keep showing? Mrs. Eddy said, legally to abolish unpaid servitude in the United States was hard, but abolition of mental slavery is a more difficult task. And I think that's just the way that things work, is that you deal with the most obvious forms of error, of evil, of these sorts of things first. First, you get rid of slavery. Then you get rid of Jim Crow. Well, once you get rid of that, you're starting to get into mental forms of prejudice. And those are much more deeply rooted and much harder to get at. So the fact that we're going through this is the fact that we're not letting that lie. We're not just allowing it to fester. It's coming to the surface, and we're saying we need to deal with this as a country and find some way of moving forward. That's a good thing. And I think these times that we go through, again, using 1968 as an example, they are tough to go through. And like you say, when the world looks at it, when you go through your feed, you don't say, Gloria God, Gloria God, Gloria God. But there's things going on beneath that are doing that. And again, that's hopefully what the monitor's looking at. And you think about economy, again, what you said, zero-sum thinking. Through all history, we've thought that we are just like, lions at the watering hole fighting over gazelle. But that's not true, is we found that in economies, we can actually grow things. There actually is no limit to the good, to the wealth that we can create. And it's all about collaboration. It's all about seeing each other. It's all about working together. And again, we're seeing this kind of question of how the economy should go, but it's really compelling us to get outside of limited thinking and to wrestle with these divine concepts of infinitude and wealth. And we're seeing where we can go. And the test is us now going forward. And then the last thing on religion, I thought you, again, put it so well. Again, just your talk being so relevant to what we do at the Monitor, is you were talking about kind of getting to a view of God, getting to a view of good. And I wrote it down. You said something like, doesn't even matter what you call it. It just is. So you can call it whatever you want to call it. The fact is, it's truth. The fact is, it's the actual underlying substructure of the universe that's good, and we all get to apply to it. And I think what we see in Burbling Up is, for so long, since the Middle Ages, we've kind of defined ourselves religiously negatively, as in almost in a tribal sense, and in terms of doctrine, in terms of, I get to tell you you can't do this. But that's not it. I think we're reaching a point where religion has to prove its utility. It has to show that it's more than just about one group exerting power or judgment over another. It has to show that it is actually the fabric of the universe. And that's a ferment that's going on right now that I think is all positive. So you kind of take, just like you said, you take these things that seem negative, but if you look at them from a different perspective, you see something different, and you see progress happening underneath. And then just more simply, when I think about, okay, those are all big, as you say, those are big, huge ideas. What do I do with that? And I say, well, how do I take that? How do I do anything with that? Sitting in my chair, okay, these things are going on. What does that mean for me? And the person's example who I always think back to is the Afghan girl, Malala Yousafzai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. She happened to be shot when I was spending time or I'd just come back from working in India and Pakistan and Afghanistan. So I had met girls like her. I mean, that her picture was something that was very much in my mind. And I just remember when she was shot, and I don't have this exactly right, but imagine someone walking onto a bus, consciously looking for the 15-year-old girl who is asking for her rights and shooting her in the head. And so they took her off the bus, and her father was there, and she said, "Father, don't worry," something like that. And she said, "We will prevail." And it's just the presence of mind and the depth of seeing, again, that there's something else. Is she wasn't seeing herself as a 15-year-old girl who'd just been shot in the head. She was seeing something more universal, that whether she lived or died was going to win. And that was the substance of the activism that she embodied. That she was... you and I were talking about it, and kind of something occurred to me. It's like activism really just depends on two things: spiritual purity and persistence. It's like, that's it. You know, if you've got that spiritual purity, if you have that sense that it's not just about you, it's about something deeper, and that's what you care about, and you just say, I'm just not going to give up, that's like the key evidence. And you see with someone like her, just who the purity of what she did and the persistence of what she did, I think, you know, there are tragedies that happen every day in Pakistan and Afghanistan. There are girls like that who are killed and maimed every day. But what this girl understood made her something more. And I think that's a lesson to all of us about what we need to do in order to kind of have that effect that we want to have.
And for the few people in the audience that might not know, she lived and she went forward.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. No, she lived, and she won the Nobel Peace Prize, and she's living in England now and is one of the foremost women's rights activists in the world.
One last question before we open it up. What is one of the things you think makes this hard, makes standing in this kind of a way hard, and what helps us deal with that?
You see, again, I go back to your lecture in a way, in the sense that what I loved was when you were talking about how the people were looking for a Messiah who was a lion, and they got a lamb, and that I think that is such a perceptive insight into the nature of power, is that the tendency, what makes this hard is that we want to go do something. We want to go out there and get on the battlements and, the tendency humanly, you want to go out and rattle cages or slap someone or do something like that. That's what you're trying to be pushed out to do. But that's the thing that needs to be considered, is that what makes it tough is that you will always be goaded into trying to take physical action. And there's nothing wrong with physical action, it's just wholly it's not successful. There's a word there that I'm trying to think of.
Maybe in and of itself, right?
Yes, it cannot get you where you want to go. And to me, again, and you touched on this in the lecture, the fact that this is a law and not just a nice, pretty thought, just look at the spirit of nonviolent resistance. Nonviolent resistance was something where it was wholly committed to essentially spiritual values. It was wholly committed to a warfare within oneself. I mean, if you look at Gandhi, you look at Dr. King, you look at Mandela, over and over there was something that they all spent time in prison. If you think about where Mandela had his moments where he became Mandela, it was in Robin prison. If you talk about, what's one of the most touching things that Martin Luther King did, it was Letter from a Birmingham Jail. It was when these people had their sense of human agency withdrawn from them, they recognized that their agency was something far more than that, and that's what gave their movements power. And so I think we just need to be really careful there's nothing wrong with protesting, there's nothing wrong with going out there, but that's not what's going to make the difference. What's going to make the difference is what you bring to it spiritually, because that's the active agent.
The question is to touch on healing the division, especially political division, and I think the question is maybe directed at least first at Mark in terms of how the Monitor is helping to bring healing to that.
It's very hard. I think I talked with a former editor, or he was a managing editor of the Monitor, who was back in the 70s and 60s, and he says this is worse than it was then, in the sense that the actual situation was far worse then, but the actual mental state of polarization and misunderstanding is actually worse now. I think, as a general level, I think we all at the Monitor need to really embrace humility and grace, as you're talking about. If there's any, what did you say when you were talking about the sun? If there's any kernel of a desire to go out and use your journalistic juju to change someone else's mind, you've lost it. Or at least for the Monitor, you've just become like every other newspaper in existence. So that we don't really need to add our voice to that because everyone else is already doing that. So how do you do that? I have been thinking a lot, as you can tell, about what does nonviolent journalism look like. I would argue that much of the journalism out there right now is amazing and incredibly helpful and very essential to a democracy, but is not mentally nonviolent. How do you embody the principles that Dr. King and Mandela stood for in a piece of journalism. That's one way. And then I could literally talk about that all night, so I'll just leave it there. And then the second thing that I often think about is what I call the motherhood of journalism. And I feel like journalism has long been a very masculine thing, hard-hitting news, speaking truth to power, all good, all necessary. But how do you heal division? You need to love everyone, you know? I have with me somewhere Martin Luther King's book, Strength to Love, and somewhere in there it says, several times, I could read you, actually, I think I have them written down. I won't take too much time. Which was the one I liked the most? We must recognize that the evil deed of the enemy, the thing that hurts, never quite expresses all he is. An element of goodness may be found in even our worst enemy. Martin Luther King was dealing with a lot worse than what we're dealing with now. And if he could say that, then we certainly can. So to me, that is a mothering quality of refusing to not see the good in your neighbor, not to see them like a child. And I think if journalism expressed that more consistently, we would be helping.
Which is not to say ignore what's wrong, but
No,
it is to
not
say
at
that
all.
if you acknowledge what's good, you can build on it.
Yes, and it's also how you're viewing the problem. Mrs. Eddy would say, you know, standing aghast at something. That only agitates you into getting into think that there's something you need to fix, as opposed to, as you said in your lecture, recognizing the actual present operation that is going on underneath. There's a different picture underneath, and as you recognize that picture as the one that has more power, you help to bring that picture to view, to consciousness. And I think you can view that from a Christian Science perspective, or even from a not just, again, I see this as science, that, you know, this was something that, you know, a Hindu and a Christian and, you know, Martin Luther King, who I don't know if he was a part of a faith tradition, but they all came to the same point. From different perspectives. It's not a religious point. It speaks to a deeper truth.
You meant Mandela.
Mandela, what did I say?
You said King.
King, okay,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
yes. King, Gandhi, Mandela.
When Jesus talked about loving your enemies, one thing that's occurred to me in my practice is that every form of ignorance or hate or agitation comes from a misconception that somebody deserves to be free from. So if you look at somebody as synonymous with the ignorance or the hate or whatever it is, and you think that's them, then you will hate your enemy. If you see them as first discovering more of who they are through this mother lens, this Christianly scientific lens, but then also recognizing that the nature of the thing that causes them to act in a harmful way is the enemy, to identify that as an imposition on them, as something manipulating them, confusing them. I mean, who are the worst bullies? The ones that have been bullied, right? In every case behind the worst actions are the worst educations and the worst experiences. And to bind up the brokenhearted is a phrase that Mary Baker Eddy used. And it's something that in order to heal on this level, we have to separate out what are the mental elements that are at the root. We cannot ignore them, but we have to heal them. Shouting at them doesn't change anything. Rattling the cage tends to only make them more defensive. But working to save the good person that is there from the thing that is weighing on them, manipulating or imposing on them, that has bullied them, that has caused that ignorance or that hate, is to help set your brother free. And there is great evidence of that, even in the news today, of people, former neo-Nazis, being transformed. Google, mother who forgives daughter's killer or something, and you'll find not just one story, but many of people who, in the face of the worst tragedies, went in and helped somebody be free from what caused that tragedy, rather than just reacting to the tragedy.
From Dr. King, while abhorring segregation, we shall love the segregationist. This is the only way to create the beloved community. We shall so appeal to your heart and conscience that we shall win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory.
About 6 months after Mandela was released from prison, decades in prison, he came to Boston, and he came to visit this very building, this place where the Monitor was being published. It was not a planned visit, so whoever saw him first ran and grabbed the editor and anyone else that was available to come. They came out on the front steps, they interviewed him. Of course, it was in the paper, I think, the next day. But one of the things he was quoted as saying was that while he was in prison, at some point, he was given access to news sources, and the Christian Science Monitor was among them. And he said that of all the news sources, the one he knew he could trust was the Christian Science Monitor. Now, there's been some things said about how journalism could be better. I think we can all acknowledge the tremendous effort, the extraordinary value of the free press in all its forms and all the best work and heart that's going into that on so many different levels. So it's not a compare and contrast by any means or a sales pitch for the Monitor. But what I'd like to focus on in that comment is the fact that go back and look at the life of the woman who established that Monitor, what she rooted her life in, how it helped her break through so many of the different preconceived notions, not just that were put upon her as an individual, but that were put upon society as a whole. She didn't necessarily set out to do that. She set out to glorify God. She set out to discover and prove more about what this discovery of the science of Christ is and does for all humanity. And what I love about that was not just the way it blessed her and her kind of entourage and even the people of her time, but you see the way it ripples forward today. You see the way somebody like Mandela was blessed by that on the other side of the globe. And this is what happens not because of a personal power, but because of the power of the principle itself. When we stand for that, when we let it move us, we don't always even know what it's going to do or how it's going to ripple out and bless, and yet we can know with scientific certainty that that's just the way it works. We don't always know the way it'll take form, but it does. There is a science to this. There is a cause and effect relationship to making spiritual discovery and what happens because of that. I'm going to leave you with these last two lines. First, from the Bible. This is back to St. Paul again. He wrote, "See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation." If you think of this in terms of discovering right now, in the face of all of the information that would belittle us, condemn us, say that we're weak, say that we don't get it, say that we don't know enough, or say that other people don't, or other people can't. In the face of that, if we take this promise that now, always, right now, is the day of salvation, and we build on that, we see how history moves. We see this divine truth sweeping down through the ages, to use a phrase that Mary Baker Eddy used, and uplifting hearts, comforting, bringing understanding to ignorance, bringing healing where there's sorrow and suffering, and moving humanity forward. And this line from Mary Baker Eddy's work, Science and Health, she starts with the word science. She's talking about Christian science, or the science of Christ. She says, "Science reveals the possibility of achieving all good and sets mortals at work to discover what God has already done." Talk about grace. When it feels so far away, that moment that it dawns, despite all the shouting at the sun, despite all the thoughts of what else might pull the sun along, that it's here, that it's now, that we don't earn it or work our way up to it. You are needed. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for taking the time. You could have done other things tonight. You are the glory of God. The world has need of you. Not because of your past history or your education or any other thing on the surface, but because of who you've been made to be, each one of us individually, uniquely. You are the light of the world. Thank you so much for being you. Thank you for making discoveries on a daily basis, each one of you in your own way. I hope this evening has been helpful to you in some way. What you bring to the world is so needed. Thank you very much.